Squidward's suicide. I just want to start off by saying that if you want an answer at the end, be prepared to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid of course, like most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it may not have been a big one, but to most kids at the time, they would have shit themselves over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and the animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and 2 other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be The Fear of the Krabby Patty, and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that this isn't final yet, animators often put mock title cards, sort of like an inside joke for us, with phony and often lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bill Valve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopted a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but just work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think more of it than just a morbid joke. One of the interns did throw a laugh at it though. The happy-go-lucky music plays as normal, and the story begins with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down, as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The Bubbles splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeated themselves, but the sound doesn't. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes, as if the skip never happened. There is a slight murmuring in the background, before they begin to boo him. Not your normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward in full frame looks visibly afraid, and the shot goes to the crowd, with SpongeBob in center frame. He too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing though. What is odd is that everybody had hyper-realistic eyes, very detailed, clearly not shot of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question it, or its appeal to children yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view of his porthole window of the night sky, so it isn't long after the concert. The unsettling part at this point is that there is no sound, literally no sound, not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking, in this silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob softly. He put his hands over his eyes and cried quietly for a minute more. All the while, a sound in the background was slowly growing from nothing to a barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly began to zoom in on his face. And by slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at 10 shots seconds apart from each other. His sobbing gets louder, more hurt, more anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists on itself. For a split second, then back to normal. The wind through the trees sounds gets slowly louder and more severe. It's as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part of this sound, and Squidward's sobbing, is that it sounded real. As if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes and the sound was coming through on the other side. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if the sounds were a little too specific, but I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame, and what we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face, popped. He was naked down to his underwear, his stomach crudely cut open and his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably on road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that this was just a sick joke. The scream flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, half body and frame. There was now what appears to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it if you get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded as if it was a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches, the laughing, a deep baritone lasting longer intervals coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew he had to. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye, too, was popped out. Naked except for her underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her, another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street of the photographer's shadow, and it was visible, very similar in shape and size to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, she ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after this second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like when the scene started. He put his tentacles down. His eyes were now done in a hyper-realism just like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, pulsating. He just stared at the screen as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all was his sobs was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the voice laughing. This time, the still photo lasted a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and back up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this time the scene was different. The entrails were just about being pulled out of the stomach wound by a large hand, and the right eye popped and dangled, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first, played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor. The animating, the sound editors, and everybody was gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not, if they were 5 different photos, they were played out as if they were 5 frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts, and we saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived at about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down here, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming and sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer, full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and that deep voice said, "Do it." And we see Squidward's hands on a shotgun. He immediately pulled the trigger in his mouth, pulls the trigger, and realistic blood and brain matter splatters the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with the force. The last 5 seconds of this episode shows the body on the bed, on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it, and then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it on my mind, and it caused me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze what happened. The analysis of the file did show that it was edited over new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware as well as glitches, as if the timestamps may have been glitched or showing the wrong time. But everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child seen was identified and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I had never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have something like this, and can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things now. That was Squidward's suicide.